Is avoiding Armageddon the question that should be on everyone's mind in Washington? Sadly, it seldom comes up. I think the greatest challenge for Americans, even more than for the Israelis, is to understand just how profoundly the world we live in has changed since the last major war that the Israelis were compelled to fight, which was in 1973. Some of your observers and audience may remember that in 1973, Israel was attacked by the Syrians in the east and the north, and at the same time attacked from the south and the west by Egypt. The problem was that Egypt had very limited goals. The Egyptian president was not interested in destroying or eradicating Israel. He simply wanted to regain control of the territory lost in 1967. So, he moved across the canal, set up a defense, and that was as far as he went. The Syrian attempt was somewhat desperate for a period, but the Israelis were able to meet that threat before turning their entire attention to Egypt. However, the present time and situation are very different. Firstly, the weapons have changed. The arsenal of rockets and missiles in the region is enormous, with estimates quoting around 130,000 rockets and missiles from Hezbollah alone. We don't even need to mention others in the region. That kind of arsenal is enough in and of itself to destroy much of Israel. Moreover, there's a problem with Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as the rest of the region being as sick of Israel as much of the world and Europe is sick of us. What I mean by that is that we are on the threshold of total war. This seems to be something that no one understands. If the Israelis march into Gaza, which I think would be a very unrewarding exercise for them, but nevertheless, they seem determined to do it, they will not only lose soldiers, but they will fail to root out the thousands of Hamas fighters there. They'll get some, but not all. They will not improve their position at all with the people of Hamas or the people living on the so-called West Bank, and the rest of the region is prepared to go to war. Stop and think about it, it's not just Iran. In fact, Iran has militias that can attack us. Anyone working with this in Iraq and Syria will confirm that. That's part of the problem. The Iranians are not going to try to lob theater ballistic missiles at Israel because the Israelis have said they would use a nuclear weapon. However, Turkey is different. The Turks have an unhappy record with the Israelis. Just a few years ago, they tried to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. The Israelis boarded their ship, killed some of their citizens, and turned back the aid. This kind of thing did not cultivate support and friendliness in Turkey. Remember, Mr. Erdogan is the de facto leading military power in the Sunni Muslim world. Finally, you have the Pakistanis who are very close to the Turks and have made it abundantly clear that the Turks will receive nuclear warheads and other capabilities from them if they need them to deter the Israelis from using a nuclear weapon. Additionally, the Turks have the largest air forces and armies in the region. The Turks can put 2 million men in the field in a little over a month, and the Turks are ferocious fighters. All of this spells doom for the Israelis if they launch this attack on Gaza. What I've just described is an unwinnable fight. Even the air power from the United States that we could commit is not going to be enough. We all know we don't have the troops on the ground. We simply don't have very many soldiers or Marines at this point. So, the president has sent 2 aircraft carriers and 2,000 Marines there. Is that going to resolve or exacerbate the situation? Well, we're watching. Mr. Biden says one thing, and Mr. Netanyahu says another. We Americans are overstretched. We're on the verge of bankruptcy and can't afford to fight 2 wars simultaneously. Our overextension is due to our commitment in Ukraine. Now, you're asking us to fully commit to you, but that's impossible. We can certainly send 2 aircraft carriers, but their impact on shore is marginal. We know this from experience. Will he do? I don't see any evidence that he will. Well, we're going to discuss in just a minute what we think he's going to say tonight, which is the opposite of what you've just advised, but before we do, cut 3. Chris. Here's a bit of a news report, but then it gets to the president where a reporter asks him, is it true that you're going to put American troops on the ground to fight alongside the Israeli Defense Forces? You'll be happy with his answer. Again, he sort of indicated that our forces won't fight on the ground, which is an easy commitment to make since we don't have much to put on the ground, but there's no mention of what the carrier will do. Right now, it looks as though most of that carrier will be committed against Hezbollah in the event that Hezbollah attacks from the north. The point is, all of this points to Armageddon. It points to a total war against Israel that will ultimately include us, at least as long as we support the Israelis. Historically, what presidents have done is they've intervened and acted as a check on Israeli power, not so much power, but on the Israeli tendency to exaggerate and go too far. We had that experience under Nixon when the Israelis crossed the Suez Canal, and it was made clear we would not tolerate that, and those Israeli troops were withdrawn. We've had previous occasions with the Israelis where we reined them in, if you will. But now, it seems as though we're not going to do that, and whatever Mr. Biden was told doesn't seem to amount to very much. So, I don't know where we're headed, but it doesn't look good. Here are both of those statements. Chris, cut 1 and cut 2. First, Prime Minister Netanyahu saying what you said he said, no humanitarian aid to Gaza, and then the President of the United States saying the opposite. First of all, I demanded the return of our captives. Get Gaza and do it quickly. Israel has been badly victimized, but the truth is that if they have an opportunity to relieve the suffering of people who have nowhere to go, they're going to be doing what they should do. And if they don't, they'll be held accountable in ways that may be unfair. My point to everyone is, look, if you have an opportunity to alleviate the pain, you should do it. Period. And if you don't, you're going to lose credibility worldwide. And I think everyone understands that. Well, he did make some sense at the very end. The failure to alleviate the suffering of innocents when you have the power to do so will diminish your credibility. Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Colonel. How dangerous is it? Maybe even futile for Israeli troops to enter Gaza on the ground. Are they mainly reservists? Are they even trained and prepared to fight guerrilla warfare against an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms? Well, several of my contacts in the IDF have indicated that this group of reservists is not as well trained as the reservists were in 1973 when they were called up. Remember, at that point, the Israelis had been through several conflicts. This group is really unfamiliar with the kind of battlefield experience that you would want if you were to send people into this environment. And remember something else, the Israelis have pulverized the northern part of Gaza. If you're going to try to fight through the ruins, that's the worst mistake that you could possibly make. If you want to find hostages, you cannot reduce the place to rubble. You know, on the way to Stalingrad, the commander of the 6th Army pleaded with the German Air Force not to bomb Stalingrad. They did so, and it benefited the defenders. I think that this bombing has probably helped the Hamas defenders. If Prime Minister Netanyahu were to ask for your advice on how to root out Hamas or how to get the hostages back unharmed, what would you tell him? I think he knows, without being told, that the probability of recovering these 200 hostages, roughly 199, I think is the latest count, is very low. Exactly. And if you go in there, the high probability is that they'll simply be executed, rather than let them fall into your hands. So, I don't have an easy answer, and I don't think any of us does for the rescue of hostages. But certainly, if you were willing to open the gates and let aid in, I'm told that the Egyptians have been told that at some point, 20 trucks of food, medicine, and other supplies will be allowed into Gaza through the Rafah entry and exit point from Gaza into Egypt. The sooner they show up, the better. But thus far, they're still sitting parked outside of that gate, and again, the Egyptians have made it very clear that they can't accept Palestinians. Now, does this mean Egyptians hate Palestinians? No. Egypt has enough trouble feeding itself and maintaining its own country. And they know something that no one bothers to point out. If you move the people living in Gaza today over the border into Egypt, the problem itself is not solved. This is the core issue right now. How do you solve the problem unless you are willing to sit down and come up with some sort of solution that is something different from what Mr. Netanyahu wants? I understand Mr. Netanyahu's position completely. He wants no negotiation. He wants to eradicate Hamas, and frankly speaking, he knows the only way to do that is to eradicate Gaza. Well, that's not going to happen, and if you try to eradicate Gaza, you are going to get total war in the region. That's the bottom line. So, what would the IDF on the ground accomplish? Would they have air support? Would they have artillery? Would they have tanks? What are they trying to do? Take people out of homes without destroying the homes, looking in basements for hostages? That doesn't sound like a very efficient use of the military to me. No, it isn't. And it's a losing proposition, which means that to treat this disease, if you want to call it that, you can't treat the symptoms, you have to go to the core problem. And the core problem is the unresolved Palestinian issue. How do you resolve that as long as there is no willingness to take that seriously and discuss it? You're going to have more and more conflict. You will never have good security in Israel, and the Israelis, they do many things well, but mobilizing 400, well, actually fielding an army of somewhere between 470,000 and 500,000, quite frankly, may not be enough when you're dealing with Hezbollah as well as Hamas. And that's the problem. And then on top of that, what do you do if suddenly the president of Turkey shows up on General Sisi's doorstep? By the way, General Sisi, the last thing he wants is a war, and he's very afraid of Egypt being dragged into one. The Egyptians and the Israelis have had good cooperation for many years now. But what happens if he thinks this war is going to spill into his country or his own people are going to rise up against him because he refuses to involve Egypt in the defense of the Palestinians? What does he do if Mr. Erdogan from Turkey says, "We will support you"? What happens in Syria with Assad, who is very much under threat from all of this? What happens if suddenly Mr. Erdogan says, "You know, we can set aside our differences over the last 20 years, we have a common enemy now, we're willing to support"? What are you going to sit there and watch 250,000 Turkish troops move on the Golan Heights? And then, of course, there's our friends in Iran. I don't think the Iranians won an all-out war by any stretch of the imagination, but they're taking a lot of precautions right now inside that country that suggests they fully expect us to attack them. And if we attack them, then there's no real rationale or reason for them to restrain themselves in any way. This is a mess. It requires leadership from the very top, from President Biden. And that doesn't include passing out cash. That means you show up and say, "Listen here, this is something we cannot do." Fury outside the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, with much of the Arab world enraged by America's backing of Israel in this war, chanting "Death to Israel" accompanied by "Death to America." Now, after Arab leaders snubbed President Biden by canceling overseas meetings, there are elevated fears of a possible second massive front. Not only from the original attack by Hamas to the south, but potentially from the north as well by the group Hezbollah based in Lebanon. Yes, it is concerning because we find ourselves, unfortunately, in a combustible situation where we have armed enemies all around us. Axios is reporting that the White House has discussed possibly using military force if Hezbollah joins the war. The president was very clear to anyone thinking of opening additional fronts and making this a more regional war, don't. And I don't think that's an empty promise. The United States and other allies, the UK, France, and others, have made it clear they will not tolerate a situation where there is truly an existential threat to Israel. All right, Minister, may I ask you? There's a report in the Times of Israel that says Biden officials have indicated to Israel in recent days that if Hezbollah initiates a war against Israel, the U.S. military will join the IDF in fighting the terrorist group. Not true. Not true. I was never said. I hope we can believe in, Colonel. Well, we know that the aircraft on board those carriers can fly in support of and alongside the Israeli Defense Force Air Force. So, let there be no question about that. And I think that's exactly why they are where they are right now. And once you involve yourself in what promises to be a total war, then you have enemies everywhere. And we're not equipped right now to handle two major regional contingencies or two major wars. Historically, successful states practice economy of enemies. If you've got one serious enemy, you try to avoid provoking anybody else. We've already provoked the Russians, and to date, they have actually been very accommodating to the Israelis. When I was last over there, all the Israeli officers made it clear to me they very much valued Russia's interest and support because the Russians made it very clear to Assad and Syria that if the Iranians established positions inside Syria on Syrian soil, they would not protect the Syrians from any attacks that the Israelis might launch. Now, this has been a touch-and-go situation, but it's worked. That's not true anymore if you listen to Mr. Putin. He's made it very clear where he stands, and he's not going to support any plan that results in the destruction, effectively what people call the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Here's President Biden on 60 Minutes with Scott Pelley, and in this clip, he is the anti-Douglas Macgregor. Are the wars in Israel and Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time? The United States of America, for God's sake, the most powerful nation in history. Not in the history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense. Well, he's living in 1991, and that's true for most of Washington. They don't understand that in addition to the Muslim world being infinitely better armed and for the first time capable of united action against Israel and potentially us, he's also dealing with a much reduced defense establishment that, let's be frank, is corrupted and demoralized by leadership that is appalling. How many times do you have to listen to somebody on television ask, well, why is it that we can't win any wars? Of course, we say that year after year after year, but we continue to spend trillions of dollars. It hasn't done us any good. Now all of a sudden, we're faced with the prospect of potentially trying to rescue Ukraine from the ruins, which I think is a dead end, but that's what I think we're trying to do, and at the same time, taking on a new war that could conceivably involve the Russians and, contrary to what Biden and everybody else thinks, Russia has not been harmed by its war in Ukraine. It's stronger and more capable now than it's been since the 80s. Colonel, tonight the president is going to speak to the nation prime time from the Oval Office, and he will announce that he's about to ask Congress for $100 billion to be spent on Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border wall. Well, you can't inherit any of it. Perhaps he will explain to us why, after nearly $2 trillion spent on our defense establishment, we cannot defend 1 inch of America's border with Mexico. I would like to hear his explanation. Secondly, Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is over. It's over. Sure, there are people dying there, but not in the numbers they were previously, and the Russian forces are moving slowly west, which, of course, is the very thing we didn't want to happen. Will they close on the river by Christmas? I don't know. They're certainly going to take Kharkiv. Those are historically Russian cities. Whether they do anything else, I think is up to them at this point. We can't stop it. We're throwing good money after bad. So, Ukraine is hopeless. Israel is in a very dangerous position, and the answer is not confrontation and threats. The answer is to negotiate, talk, diplomacy. The problem is we sent Mr. Blinken all over the Middle East to remind everyone that he was Jewish and it was very important to him. Well, that's nice, but it doesn't do anything for the United States of America. He should be an American and simply say, we Americans are not going to allow Gaza to be destroyed or its population to be expelled. That's off the table. We can't support that. We hear all of this about values day and night. We value Israel. We think it deserves to exist. We don't support people who want to destroy it. On the other hand, our values dictate opposition to ethnic cleansing and opposition to the mass murder of innocents, and if you look at the bombing that's going on right now, I'm afraid that's an argument that needs to be made, and it's not being made at all. Instead, we're shoveling more money in that direction, and I guess that's probably similar to what we've done in a lot of cases. That money won't really go to Israel. It'll end up paying for more equipment, bombs, and weapons that essentially end up in the pockets of our own defense industries, shareholders, and members of Congress. And what is $20 billion for Taiwan going to do? There's no threat to Taiwan. Why is he rattling that saber tonight? Well, it seems as though his advisors and his principal cabinet members are advocates for total war. War on one. War everywhere. War all the time. You know, this won't work. We can't do it. We can't afford it. We're going to go under. And I don't know how soon we'll go under, but we'll go under. This is not in Israel's interest because if this becomes total war, I think Israel could end up looking a lot like Ukraine, only worse. I don't think that's what we want. I don't want it. My phone has rung off the hook, and people say, you've got to speak. You've got to speak and say that we have to save Israel from itself. I think that's what a president should be thinking right now. We're all sympathetic to what happened to the Israelis. That's not up for debate. What we're not sympathetic to is building enemy alliances against Israel. We need to break those up. We need to figure out how to break those up, and we need to persuade the Israelis to help us do that.